Welcome back to ACER Explained. Today I'm going through Section 3 of the ACER Practice Test Booklet. In this video, I'm going through questions 14 to 17, so Unit 5. As usual, I'm identifying prerequisite knowledge that you might need, reasoning skills, as well as bootcamp resources. This stimulus is a chunk of text. It's talking about flatfish, and they're talking about whether or not the flatfish developed to be left-eyed or right-eyed. And we're told that in the coast of the west coast of the United States of America, the population of flatfish is actually evenly split between left-eyed and right-eyed individuals, whereas in the Japanese waters, all of them are left-eyed. And then in between, you have about 70% being left-eyed. And then we have three different hypotheses that kind of try to explain this phenomenon. Question 14 is asking us to look at hypothesis 1. So hypothesis 1 is basically saying that the reason that all the Japanese flounder fish are left-eyed is because they have a dominant allele that results in the expression of a left-eyed phenotype. And we're given LL as kind of the genotype. And then the other part of the hypothesis is that the West Coast fish, so from the United States, they are homozygous for an allele that basically means that it's neutral. It could be either or. There's no kind of influence on whether or not they will be left-sided or right-sided, which means that there's going to be a 50% chance of either. Okay? So this is the West Coast, and this is the Japanese. And then so the question is asking that the offspring of a cross between Japanese starry flounder, so that's LL capital, and a right-eyed West Coast starry flounder, which is LL lowercase, would be which of the following? So in order to find the F1, we need to do a cross. Okay, so this is where kind of some genetics knowledge comes in. So you have to do a Mendelian cross here. So you have capital L, capital lowercase. There we go. And you also need to know kind of what the effects of a dominant versus recessive allele is going to be. So a dominant allele is going to be expressed regardless of whether or not the second allele is dominant or recessive. So you only need one copy of this capital L for it to be left-eyed. Whereas for it to be neutral, you need two copies of this recessive allele because it's recessive. In order for a recessive allele to be actually expressed, you need two of those alleles. Whereas dominant, you only need one. So over here, all of our offspring, so this is our F1 population, all four of them. And so all of the F1 population shares the same genotype, and that's capital L and lowercase l. And because we have one capital L here and we know how dominant alleles function, all of these are going to have the phenotype that's associated with the capital L, and that is left-eyed. Okay, so that means that our answer option is C. They're going to be left-eyed flounders only. For this question, you needed to know the kind of basic Mendelian cross, so that requires knowledge of genetics. However, very importantly, you also needed to know how to identify the important information and kind of ignore the rest for this first question especially. It's not all of the information in the entire passage is not needed for this one question, so you don't want to waste your time getting bogged down in the details when you could just practice identifying the important information and answering the question as quickly as possible. So the bootcamp resources that can help with this are the acceleration class, chunky texts, as well as the content in action on genetics. We have genetics 1 and genetics 2. Question 15 is asking us to look at hypothesis 3, which is telling us that, well, it's predicting that there are three different alleles that determine this gene. And so the phenotype of the capital L is left-eyed, lowercase l is right-eyed, and lowercase l with apostrophe is neutral. Okay, so the capital L is dominant to lowercase l, and lowercase l is dominant to lowercase l with the apostrophe. So that's the information that we're given. And the question is asking us many crosses between this and this individual would result in what proportion of F1 individuals. And so the reason they say many crosses is because, for example, you might say have a 50% chance of your child having blonde hair versus brunette hair. And that could be kind of like the statistical, the genetic prediction. However, there is still a chance that all of your children end up with blonde hair. Probability doesn't always equal to what is actually going to happen, especially in small numbers. So flipping a coin 3 times, you're likely to get 3 heads. But flipping a coin 1,000 times, you're closer to get that 50-50 proportion, right? So that's why it says many crosses. And so let's do this cross. So we have capital L and L with an apostrophe. Then we have these two. Okay, so we have here, just filling these out. And now let's look at the phenotypes. So we have capital L is going to be dominant because we know that it's dominant over both the right and neutral alleles. So these are going to be left. Okay, then we have the right allele over the neutral allele. So that's going to be right because it's dominant. Then we have 2 neutral alleles, and we're basically told that there's fish that have this genotype, 50% are going to be left-eyed and 50% are going to be right-eyed. Okay, so over here we have left, we have this 50%. Now we have this 25%. And then this box itself is 25%, but we split it. 50% of 25% is 12.5%. 12.5%. So this is 50% left, 25% right, and we just add these to this, right? Because half of these are probably going to be left and half are going to be right. So we can say that we have we have 62.5 left, and then we have a 37.5 right. And the closest values to this are represented by the answer option C. So I won't go through this one again. It's the same exact reasoning and prerequisite knowledge that you needed for the previous question. So I just simplified the working out here because the board was getting a little bit messy. And also here, the numerator should be 3. So this is kind of the value that you get. And then obviously in terms of probabilities, the opposite should be true for right. So it should just be left with a quarter. But let's just double check this. So we had our right values here, 1/12 and 1/6. So adding these, I'm going to multiply this by 2 to get the common denominator. And we're left with 3/12, which is a quarter. So we have 3/4 of our population left-eyed, and 1/4 of our F1 population is right-eyed. So looking at our answer options, the first option is 3 left-eyed flounder for every 1 right-eyed flounder. And this is actually true because if you look at it this way, if you have 4 flounders total, you're going to have 3 out of 4 of them being left-eyed, and then 1 out of 4 of them being right-eyed. So this is actually correct, and this is our right answer. And then, yeah, I would be quite confident with circling that and moving on to the next question. For this question, it's the same prerequisite information as well as the reasoning skills used, identifying the important information from the stimulus, but also you needed to be quite quick with your calculations in this case and your fractions. And the bootcamp resources that can help with this one is the same ones that I mentioned before, but then also there's an acceleration class on calculations and formulae. Now, question 17 is a bit of a different one from the series. So it's given us a scenario. So it's saying that left-eyed mid-Pacific females and right-eyed West Coast males were crossed. And thousands of offspring were kept in standard lab conditions. And 50% of the offspring were right-eyed and 50% of the offspring were left-eyed. And it's asking us what this finding can completely rule out, or if it can completely rule out any of the hypotheses. So importantly, we actually aren't given any information about the West Coast individuals in the hypotheses. We basically are just told at the beginning 70% of the individuals are left-eyed. And this is the mid-Pacific. And then 50% are left-eyed and 50% are right-eyed. I'll say 30% right. On the West Coast. Now, what you could either do is go down a rabbit hole of calculations, or you could use your reasoning and think about the probability thing that I was saying before, where although there's in Mendelian genetics, for example, you have A, B, B. Sorry, that would be A, and that would be A as well. Although there's a 50% chance of getting AA, 25 of getting A capital, and 25 of getting lowercase a, although this is the Mendelian probability, that doesn't necessarily mean that this will always be true. If you randomly cross these individuals, there is still a chance that all of the offspring, say they have 5 offspring, there's a chance that all 5 are heterozygous, and that would be 100% of the population, right? So you have to remember here that Mendelian genetics, the probabilities that you're given, they are simply probabilities. It's not a prediction of what is going to happen. And so over here, we're not given a theoretical cross of, a very, very large number of individuals, in which case, if you're assuming that the population is infinite, that's when you would get these ratios. You simply have an experiment, right? And so there is a chance, it might be a small chance, but there is a chance that exactly 50% of the offspring are right-eyed and exactly 50% of the offspring are left-eyed simply by chance, right? Because you could flip a coin 100 times and by chance get heads 100% of the time. There's no guarantee that you're going to get exactly 50%. You're probably not going to get heads 100% of the time, but you may get heads 60% of the time and tails 40% of the time. That's how probability works. And so you can't actually rule out any of these hypotheses based on this one experiment. And therefore the answer is D. So for this, you needed your prerequisite knowledge of Mendelian genetics, just basic crossing, how it works. But more so, you had to just be aware of probability and how probability works. And so the reasoning skills used here are identifying the important information and also just understanding probabilities. And so the bootcamp resources that would be helpful for this are the reasoning skills course to help you kind of think in this sort of a way, the chunky text acceleration class, and the genetics content in action videos. And that brings us to the end of Unit 5. Please like, share, and subscribe for more GAMSAT help. We really appreciate your feedback. We have our Instagram here at Thank Flip GAMSAT, as well as the podcast Thank Flip GAMSAT Nurses Doing GAMSAT if you want to hear more from us. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.